You want to hire people that care about what they do, that are skilled at what they do, that want to make a difference, but at the same time can recognize that as part of an investment organization, we sit and are housed in an organization which perhaps has a slightly different culture than what a typical investment organization has. I personally believe in trying to define roles reasonably well, give people a sense of your expectations, and give them a lot of leash. I personally do not like to micromanage people. I can do it, but I don't like to, because I think people flourish in an environment where they have an opportunity to see how far they can run with the ball and how much they can do with a given project or a task. You find great people wherever you can. You really shouldn't have blinders in terms of if you're looking to hire a particular person that you have to look at this type of organization. It's more a question of looking at the totality of their background and trying to see, have they built the skill set, and can they, in the interviewing process, demonstrate the intellectual flexibility and the personal flexibility to be able to get things done in a range of different circumstances. It's a very different universe. I mean, in the for-profit world, the objectives by and large are very clear. You know, basically you want to make a profit for the company so the company survives and it can grow and survive long run. Hopefully that helps the stock price. You will have better compensation, the stock price goes up and everybody's happy. In the not-for-profit world, the objectives are a little different. And I think that actually makes it tougher to manage, because the objectives sometimes can be, there can be a multitude of objectives and sometimes they can be conflicting. Whereas in the for-profit world, I think there's it's a little bit more clarity. Well, they like the long-term incentives of basically getting a bonus and possibly getting stock. But I think it's a question of what they learn along the way. It's more experiential, and how they can grow their skill set, adding more arrows to their quiver so they can sustain their career long run. And frankly, managing a career is much more tricky than when I started out a few years ago. In that, you know, back when I was coming out of business school, it was a question of, it was just more or less assumed that you would continue to move up the ladder, and opportunities came fairly frequently. Now, because of the fact that baby boomers are clogging the pipeline, and people are not retiring quite as quickly because of their own personal financial circumstances, that I think folks are going to be in roles perhaps a bit longer than they might have historically. So I think, again, they need to take the long view. I think it's a question of, you know, being willing to do a multitude of things. I've hired in a couple of people who had come from other corporate pension investment organizations for other companies, and they were used to a certain model. And because we were building an organization from the ground up, we had to do a lot of things that typically you wouldn't do in an established organization. You really had to get your hands dirty. And the folks, the one particular individual wasn't comfortable with that, and she was gone within 3 months. That was her decision, not ours. It was probably for the best in the long run. But I think it's a question of being willing to do what you have to do to get the job done, because I think that's successful in all environments. I frankly don't think it's possible, because, I mean, admittedly, I made a mistake on that one individual. It's a question of kind of, you know, nuances in what they say and asking the right question, and sometimes you fall into the trap of asking the typical interview questions. I think you can get some sense of that through references, but at the same time, I mean, if somebody gives you a reference, they're going to give you a reference that's going to say good things. So if you're trying to tease out an individual's weakness, that may be a little harder to do, but I think it's important to try. I think you have to get over it, because that's the world in which we live. I mean, it's not too dissimilar from working in a technology company, where people tend to have relatively short duration of their employment with the company because they're moving on to other things. And I suspect that's also true to some extent in the nonprofit world. And I just think it's the nature of the beast. And you just, you know, for better or for worse, you have to deal with it. I wish I had an easy answer. I think it's a question of, you know, being flexible in terms of what you can try to motivate those folks to keep them. The challenge is that the people that you have hired, they have their own set of objectives and goals that they have. And sometimes it will work, sometimes it will not work. But I think it's sort of a continuing process of, I won't say experimenting, that's a bad word, but being flexible in your approach and trying to tailor it for the individual to give them the incentive. And recognizing the nonprofit world, you don't really have monetary incentives, but you have the incentives of the richness of the experience, other things that you could do in the organization. Use that as kind of a carrot to try to retain them for a period of time. That's a really good question, and it's a very hard question. I think it depends on the organization in which you're operating. In prior roles that I've had, it was much easier to cut your losses and go. In other words, if somebody wasn't working out, you address it. You go through a period of trying to performance improvement if that's the issue. If it's an attitudinal issue, that's much, much harder. But the thing is, if they're not really a good fit long term, you're doing everybody, them and you, a favor if you just basically essentially sever the relationship and move on. Where I work currently, that's a more difficult thing to do because by and large, as a company, we tend not to fire people. I think often what happens, I haven't done this, but often what happens in large organizations is that, people will transfer around to other parts of the company. But frankly, I think that's a disservice to the individual and to the company, because if it's really not working out, you just need to admit that and, both sides move on. I think when you are interviewing people, or first of all, when you're trying to position a new role, that you be honest in terms of, in the job description, of what it is. And because there are going to be warts on it, and that's okay. But people just need to know. And in the interviewing process, that you want to have a reasonable give and take. I mean, certainly you ask questions to try to get a sense of, is this the right person? But you want to give the interviewee the chance to ask questions. And what I have done, and I've done this for years, particularly since I've been in a multiple number of organizations, is, I've been here for a certain period of time. I came in from the outside. You could ask me any question, and I'll tell you the truth. Now, they may be willing to do that or not. They may be reluctant to do that. But the thing is, that way they've got a chance to get a better sense, if they're willing to show the courage and ask the question, of some things that might be reservations they might have about the firm or about the environment.